In recent weeks, there have been titanic changes in Russian politics. Changes that will determine not only the evolution of the war in Ukraine, but also the future of the Russian armed forces. We are talking about a new strategy, a new vision, with which Putin now hopes to turn Russia's military power around. In this video, we will tell you all the details. So let's get started. Let's begin with what could be one of the soap operas of the year in Russian politics. Sergei Shoigu, the previous Minister of Defense, the man in charge of the war, the strong hand, and Vladimir Putin's right-hand man, was dismissed on May 12th.
Putin replaces defense minister in rare cabinet shakeup.
Shoigu had been at the head of the Russian armed forces for almost 12 years, a time during which he was far from standing idly by. Quite the contrary. He has been Russia's key figure in 4 of the country's major military operations in recent years. The invasion of Crimea in 2014, the operation in support of al-Assad in Syria in 2015, the execution of the mega plan for military reform and modernization, and of course, the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So the question is, why was he dismissed? It certainly wasn't because he doesn't exactly get along with Putin. The Russian president has summered, played field hockey, gone fishing, and even sunbathed in the Siberian taiga with the man. Shoigu has been perhaps Putin's best friend in the cabinet. And yet, all of a sudden, wham! Out of government barely 2 months after the Russian presidential elections, in which, unsurprisingly, Putin once again swept the board with 87% of the votes. It is true that the president has repositioned Shoigu as Secretary of the Security Council, but logically, this position in an advisory body is much less important than leading the armed forces. So the crux of the matter, why on earth did he dismiss him? Well, let's see. At the moment, there are many theories circulating. One of them even suggests that Shoigu could be involved in a corruption scam.
Bribery case puts Russian Defense Minister Shoigu in the crosshairs.
Yes, I know that power and corruption in Russia almost go hand in hand. That's true. But there are limits to everything, in case you go too far and make the big boss look bad. Especially if they accuse you of stealing the money that should go to the military on the front. That would be too much. Well, just a few weeks ago, the police arrested Shoigu's closest defense ministry deputy, Timur Ivanov. Ivanov, who was in charge of such important projects as the reconstruction of Mariupol in Ukraine, has been accused of receiving bribes. But of course, whether this is the real motive is still a bit of a mystery to us. After all, Shoigu is not Ivanov. And let me stress, we are talking about Russia here, a country where not being corrupt makes you a suspect. Normally, when a high-ranking Russian official is accused of corruption, it is usually because someone above him, in this case Putin, wants to get rid of him. And I wonder, could things like this have anything to do with it?
У нас нехватка боеприпасов! 70%! Shoigu! Герасимов! Где боеприпасы?
Yes, okay, I know that Russia is far from being at its weakest on the front. In fact, the Russians have regained the initiative and even counterattacked in the Kharkiv region, but that doesn't mean things have stopped being a mess. Russia continues to have huge problems in supplying its soldiers with weapons, and in any case, it's still carnage on the front. In fact, if Russian pressure is being upheld, it is only because more and more young people are being sent to die in Ukraine. There seems to be no end to the Russian meat grinder strategy, and in that respect, things have not improved much.
Russia loses over 8,000 troops and nearly 80 tanks in a week. Kiev, Russia had sustained 1,260 casualties in the past day, Kiev's armed forces said.
Okay, surely the Ukrainian armed forces are not the best source of information. I think we all know that. Neither the Ukrainian ones, and certainly not the Russian ones. But what is certain is that overall, there is a very broad consensus among the intelligence services and assessment teams that are monitoring this war. Russia is still shredding men at full speed. This has been and continues to be a major problem. Firstly, because it means that troops without combat experience are constantly having to come in. And secondly, because there comes a point where it could greatly undermine the popularity of the war within Russia. In fact, this issue is by far what has worn Shoigu down the most. Prigozhin's video accusing him of practically selling out soldiers because of his incompetence was, in fact, devastating to his image. But now, to what extent is Shoigu to blame for the poor performance in Ukraine? Is this really the cause of his dismissal? Or is there some other reason for Putin to have made this decision? And by the way, when we talk about sensitive topics like Russia, every word matters, and each media outlet has its own perspective and editorial analysis. That's why today we want to introduce Ground News, a tool that analyzes hundreds of media outlets for you, allowing you to compare different perspectives quickly and easily. Take a look at this news story. Moscow warns it will target UK military sites if British weapons are used in attacks against Russia. This has been covered by more than 60 media outlets with very different ideologies. Thanks to the graph on the right, we can see that the coverage is distributed almost evenly from left to right. And yes, I know what you're thinking. How does ground news work? It uses a methodology combining 3 independent news monitoring organizations. The key feature is that we can compare the different headlines each outlet uses for a story, understand their perspectives, and assess their veracity. For example, Kyiv Independent and Politico Europe, 2 left-leaning news outlets, emphasize the military threat to the UK and Ukraine after Cameron's comments, while right-leaning sources outside Russia focus more on the UK ambassador in Russia. And now, the million-dollar question: how can you access ground news? You can do it through the QR code on the screen or by going to ground.news/VisualPolitik.en. We leave you the link in the description. With this code, you'll get a 40% discount on their Vantage version with full and unlimited access to all features, including information on media ownership and reporting objectivity. With that said, many thanks to Ground News for supporting this video. Try it out and let us know what you think. And now, let's continue with today's video.
Shoigu, the culprit?
It's no secret, the invasion of Ukraine is not going the way Putin wanted it to. I know what you're thinking, there you go, VisualPolitik is at it again, raging against Russia, and okay, you may have a point, but what can I say? That's just the way things are. It's not propaganda from one side nor the other. The initial intention of the Kremlin was to take the neighboring country in a matter of weeks, and that, it is clear, it did not succeed. Those weeks have already turned into more than 2 years, and everything indicates a third, and who knows, maybe even a fourth. And that was not something that was in the plans. On top of that, Putin's government has almost from the beginning of the war placed all state resources in Shoigu's hands. And the fact is that since Shoigu has been defense minister, the Russian military budget has shot up by about 60%. Shoigu is the minister who has handled the most money since the fall of the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, we've all seen the result. Terrible. And keep in mind, this is probably something Putin himself has thought about at times. Don't believe me? Well, take a look.
Putin literally turned his back on his loyal defense minister on Russian state TV.
However, despite everything, Putin did not dismiss him at that time. And little by little, things were, well, somehow getting better. After the unexpected Ukrainian resistance, the Russian Defense Ministry began to reorient his strategy, and Shoigu changed the ship's course. The military could have had a budget of nearly $100 billion by 2023, according to SIPRI estimates, a honeypot that the ministry takes advantage of to boost the Russian military industrial complex. The armed forces needed more bullets, more grenades, more weapons, and many vehicles. And logically, all these supplies and equipment had to come mainly from local industry, for cost, for agility, and also because of the sanctions. The result of all this effort? Well, according to the Russian government, the efforts of the ministry led by Shoigu enabled the army to receive 1,500 tanks, 2,200 armored combat vehicles, 1,400 missiles, and hundreds of thousands of new artillery units and weapons over the course of 2023. Well, at least that's what they say, of course, because according to various analyses, these figures could be very, very inflated. Not to mention the accounting tricks that apparently passed off imported weapons and components as Russian equipment. Be that as it may, what is certain is that Russian military equipment increased sharply in 2023, and that this managed to save the poor reputation of Shoigu, who had been badly bruised after the huge fiasco of the war. And that is not all. On top of that, under Shoigu's leadership, Russia has quite successfully managed to dodge international sanctions. So when push comes to shove, the Russian bear has continued to buy military components and supplies on the international market. I think this chart makes it quite clear here. On VisualPolitik, we've already told you how they are doing it. They have done it thanks to a complex network of shell companies and using allied or nearby countries as a kind of frontman. But it goes further than that. This sort of survival economy that was implemented in 2023 in order to be able to continue to nurture the military has begun to bear certain fruits. Fruits such as these.
Ukraine warns northern front has significantly worsened as Russia claims capture of several villages.
By integrating elite and conventional forces, increasing the number of troops deployed, improving its defenses and target detection capabilities, as well as massively increasing the use of drones, Russia has managed to regain the initiative in Ukraine. And naturally, all this has happened under the leadership of Sergei Shoigu as the Minister of Defense. Yes, things started badly for them, but then at least they have improved. So doesn't it seem a bit odd that he is being dismissed just now, now? Why risk everything with profile changes at this point in time? Well, you see, this is where the story takes a 180-degree turn. Shoigu was most likely not even pushed aside due to the Russian military's performance in Ukraine. And you will say, let's see, Josh, get it straight. If it's not because of corruption, not because of Ukraine, not because Putin doesn't like him, why on earth has one of Russia's great power brokers been removed? Well, the key seems to lie not with Shoigu, but with his successor. And this brings us directly to another of the major changes taking place in Russia's armed forces. Listen up.
The military Keynesianism.
Andrei Belousov. In a nutshell, since 2020 and until days before his appointment as Minister of Defense, he was the Deputy Prime Minister of Russia. Of course, it's not that he didn't have very significant influence in the regime, at least not as far as the war was concerned. But then, who the heck is this guy? Does he have any success as a military strategist behind him? Maybe he comes from military intelligence. Cold, freezing, none of those things, none of that. Belousov is an economist. Yes, just as you heard. Putin has swapped a general for an economist to head the defense ministry in the middle of a bloody war. I'm sure you weren't expecting that one. But why a profile that in principle we might think is so alien to the world of war? Well, this change has a lot to do precisely with this. Andrei Belousov has conducted several pieces of economic research on the collapse of the Soviet regime and the fall of Soviet industry at the time. And not only that, in 2000 he founded the Center for Macroeconomic Analysis and Short-Term Forecasting, where he published a lot of analyses on the Russian economic situation. Well, all this work helped him to become a consultant to the Russian Ministry of Economy, gaining more and more reputation. But okay, I'm sure right now many of you are thinking, I don't understand anything. What the hell can a profile of a technical economist bring to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Ministry of Defense? Well, Putin thinks a lot, and this time, he might not be wrong. Let's see. Much of Belousov's work has focused on the state of Russian industry and its lack of competitiveness, which is precisely one of the Achilles heels suffered by the Russian military industry. Well, actually, the entire national economy in general. And that's where his contribution could be absolutely crucial, especially now that efforts are being focused on trying to survive without Western technologies. Now, why just now, which is not precisely Russia's worst moment on the front, is there a U-turn to put such a guy at the head of the ministry? Well, first, surely, because Putin never believed that the war would drag on, and second, because after the initial disaster, what was most urgent was to stabilize the front and reorganize the army's deployments, defenses, and operations. It was a job that necessarily had to be piloted and supervised by a military officer. However, once that goal was achieved, then it was time to enter a new phase, preparing the Russian economy to face a long war, reorganizing logistics, and working primarily with the military industry. And that's where The Economist comes in. You can see the point, can't you? The point is that Putin might have understood that wars are not won exclusively with military strategy, but also with the ability to resist, distribute, and replenish forces.
Changing the defense ministry leadership signals that Russia's president is preparing for many more years of war. Putin's priority is war. War of attrition is won by economics.
And in this, he is not wrong. What's more, Putin could have an important advantage here when it comes to squeezing the Russian economy to increase military resources. What am I referring to? Any ideas? Exactly, that Russia is in practice a dictatorship. You see, Putin doesn't care at this point what the Russians think, or the shortages and hardships that ordinary people will go through because of a war of attrition that could drag on for several more years. And what's more, he is counting on that opinion in the West to be totally different. That as long as Russia manages to resist, the West will end up getting tired of Ukraine, something that in a way is already happening. The best example is undoubtedly the United States, a country that, yes, has just approved a huge aid package for Ukraine, but nevertheless spent months with aid suspended due to disagreements between Republicans and Democrats. And indeed, headlines like this one are becoming more and more frequent.
American public support for assistance to Ukraine has waned, but still considerable.
This is true in the United States, but also in Europe.
Over the last 2 years, backing for EU actions related to the war has decreased as compared to spring 2022. Humanitarian aid maintains the highest approval, dropping by only 3 pp. Support for financial and military aid have decreased by 9 pp and 8 pp, respectively.
So, politically speaking, Putin's strength in winning a war of attrition may be greater in the long run, and that is probably what explains Belousov's appointment. Even so, what lies ahead for the new minister is no small matter. Belousov will have to reform the entire military industry while fighting a tough war of attrition. It's a bit like serving a restaurant full of customers while there's a fire in the kitchen. And no, we're not exaggerating. Check it out. In the last 20 years, Russian military spending has increased almost fourfold, with clear peaks after the annexation of Crimea and the invasion against Ukraine. And make no mistake that it is very frustrating for Putin to see huge amounts of money being squandered on weapons, equipment, and industry that are not up to the task. Now, changing that is precisely the challenge of the new Minister of Defense. In fact, as early as January 2024, Belousov gave the first hints of what has ultimately ended up being his new work. Earlier this year, he promised that the country would succeed in producing more than 32,000 drones each year, which would mean tripling Russian drone production. We are talking about a promise that anyone would find very difficult to achieve with the sanctions that Russia is enduring, a country that has been forced to import Iranian drones for use in Ukraine. Nevertheless, Putin seems to see Belousov as a guy capable of ramping up arms production in the coming years. It turns out, the new Minister of Defense has been described by several economists as a fan of military Keynesianism. And you will say, military Keynesianism? But what on earth is that? Are you sure you didn't make a mistake with the visual economic content? Well, I give you my word no, I am referring to precisely this.
Belousov keenly believes innovation happens because the government invests in innovation, and that economic growth happens because the government forces businesses to make investments.
Belousov believes that state intervention is key to getting the military industry to embrace innovation and improve its production levels and standards. This would enable them to better supply the military and even increase their sales to the rest of the world, which is usually a very important source of income for Russia, and one that has been in the doldrums lately. Well, in his view, Russian companies are plagued by corruption, bureaucracy, and inefficiency, and it is up to the state to put things in order. And let's see, he's not wrong about the companies. The problem is that the state in Russia doesn't measure up either. It's even more corrupt, but that's the challenge ahead. But that's not all. Belousov is also a strong advocate of Russian technological sovereignty, and that is something he has advocated since long before the war in Ukraine began. For the new minister, it is absolutely key to reverse the country's dependence on North Korean missiles and Iranian drones, as well as to replace all foreign technologies in everything to do with defense. VisualPolitik community, I am sure that now you understand perfectly well the beheading of Shoigu, the appointment of the new minister, and the changes that are taking place in the Russian military. But of course, we are talking about Russia, and that means doubts. Many doubts. If Shoigu's term as minister was plagued by cases of corruption and influence peddling, this will probably not change much with the new one either. Basically because we're talking about a structural problem. It is plain and simple how Russia works. A country where everything works with favors and where all favors are usually bought with money. But wait a minute, because it's not just about Ukraine. Putin is probably also thinking much further ahead.
Russia's military is already preparing for its next war. Top Polish general confirms Russian preparations for conflict with NATO.
Putin not only wants his soldiers to be able to subdue Ukraine, but his obsession is also that his armed forces should be up to the task of a war with NATO. And that is a huge challenge, especially given the sorry state of Russia's armed forces after more than 2 years of war that have wiped out much of the best military equipment available to them. The question is, could Andrei Belousov be the man to bring Moscow's armed forces back up to speed? Well, only time will tell. And of course, VisualPolitik will be there to tell you all about it. In the meantime, the questions are for you. What do you think of Shoigu's dismissal as minister? What are your theories? Do you think Belousov will succeed in meeting Putin's expectations? Well, leave us your opinions below in the comments and let's launch a debate. And very important, if you liked this video, hit the like button and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. As always, thank you very much for being there. Best regards and see you next time.